or a communist-leaning person would applaud Jeff Bezos for what he was saying. But I'm just really sick of this like bashing of the billionaires, because the billionaires actually are the ones contributing the most to society. Let's talk about how many. Oh yeah, I feel so bad for them. Let's talk about how many jobs Amazon has created. Let's talk about how many people are paying their bills because of Amazon. How many of the jobs in that. So I'm just really against this whole like, oh my God, the capitalists are the bad guys. In terms of his motive.
Emily Austin argued that billionaires shouldn't be bashed. They create jobs, they pay taxes, and if you push them too hard, they can always move to Puerto Rico. Isaiah pushed back with a very specific number. He pointed out that Amazon paid an effective corporate tax rate of just 1.4% while receiving $17 billion in tax breaks. Then Jeff Bezos appeared in an audio clip to make another point. He argued that even doubling his taxes wouldn't solve the problems facing a struggling public school teacher in Queens. And technically, he's right. But the panel never really asked the bigger question. Whose policies helped create the conditions that left that teacher struggling in the first place? Welcome to the debate, Chase. Today, we're breaking down a panel discussion about billionaire taxation, the decline of small businesses, and the growing threat AI poses to working-class jobs. And we're also looking at the moment the famous tax flight argument ran into research from Cornell University that seemed to seriously challenge it. Let's get into it.
Isaiah, do you think Jeff Bezos has a point here? What's his motivation in saying this?
That's the question.
Look, I think that Bezos has a variety of things that he's looking at. Maybe he wants to run for office. Who knows? You never really know. At the end of the day, I do think that it's rather interesting that Jeff has talked about whether or not the 1% is paying effectively too much in taxes. I think that's a pretty absurd argument to make, because Amazon only paid about 1.4% of corporate taxes, and they got $17 billion worth of tax breaks.
And we talked about this issue when he did this interview, and it also comes down to about how the American tax code is written, and you have wage earners, and then you have people like Jeff Bezos who are paid in a very different way, and that is taxed in a very different way.
Yeah.
Right, and I think that there's, I think some people would probably be surprised to realize the bottom 50% is roughly people making $55,000 a year as individual earners, and below that, I think there's a lot of Americans who feel like, well, I'm among those who are struggling, but especially in major cities, you're making a little more than that, you're making closer to six figures, and you may think that you're struggling to get ahead in the state of this inflationary economy, and you need relief. This would not give you relief. I mean, I'm for completely revamping the entire tax code, and I think the 1% is way too broadly defined, but there's way too many carve-outs for the very top, and I think that this is an animating issue. I think in this populist moment on the right, there is a moment that you could have future politicians, if a J.D. Vance ends up running, that lean a little more into the taxing the billionaires, which has never been a Republican position previously, but I think there is an appetite for the wealthiest to contribute more.
I want to play another clip from Bezos, that he was making the case that he pays billions of dollars in taxes, and that that raising those wouldn't necessarily help a teacher in Queens. This is what he said.
These people sometimes say that I don't pay taxes. That's true. I pay billions of dollars in taxes. And it's a perfect, again, if people want me to pay more billions, right, then let's have that debate. But don't pretend, that's going to solve the problem. You could double the taxes I pay, and it's not going to help that teacher in Queens. I promise you. So you can't connect those two things, not logically.
Warren Mamdani tweeted after that. He said, I know a few teachers in Queens who would beg to differ. Emily, what were you going to say?
First of all, I'm surprised Mamdani wasn't patting him on the back with his initial statement. I thought every single socialist or communist-leaning person would applaud Jeff Bezos for what he was saying. But I'm just really sick of this like bashing of the billionaires, because the billionaires actually are the ones contributing the most to society. Let's talk about how many. Oh yeah, I feel so bad for them. Let's talk about how many jobs Amazon has created. Let's talk about how many people are paying their bills because of Amazon. How many of the jobs in that. So I'm just really against this whole like, oh my God, the capitalists are the bad guys. In terms of his motivation, I think that's the question. I wasn't even thinking about a political run, but that's starting to make the most sense. And then theoretically, he's not necessarily wrong. If you are not taxing them, they're probably spending more money into the economy, and that wealth is spreading on its own organically. However, you're right, this is not the traditional Republican thinking, and the handouts and the free money does not solve the problem.
Isaiah cited Amazon's effective corporate tax rate of 1.4%, along with $17 billion in tax breaks. That's not just a talking point. Those figures come from Amazon's financial disclosures and analysis from tax policy researchers. And this is where the argument gets interesting. Defenders of Amazon's tax position often point to the jobs it creates, the innovation it drives, and the economic activity it generates. All of those things are real. But there's another side to the equation. Amazon operates within a system that depends heavily on public investment. It uses roads and transportation networks. It depends on an educated workforce. It relies on courts and legal systems to enforce contracts and protect intellectual property. All of that infrastructure costs money. So the question isn't simply whether Amazon creates jobs. The question is whether a company generating hundreds of billions of dollars in revenue while paying an effective tax rate of 1.4% is contributing its fair share toward the public system that makes that business possible. And that's where the debate gets much harder to dismiss. Then there's Jeff Bezos' argument. Bezos suggested that even doubling his taxes wouldn't solve the problems facing one struggling teacher in Queens. Again, as a mathematical statement, that's obviously true. One billionaire paying more in taxes isn't going to suddenly fix every struggling school in America. But that's not really the point. The argument for progressive taxation isn't that taxing Jeff Bezos more will magically solve every problem. The question is whether the overall tax system is collecting enough from those who have accumulated the most wealth to fund the public services and infrastructure that society depends on.
We know the private sector investment to build new manufacturing facilities has decreased. So it hasn't spurred an increase in investment into the economy. We've seen that across the board, and that's from Fred data.
No, I'm talking more of like the lower 50% who, where if they had extra money, they'd probably go to the grocery store and spend it. They would probably be spending that money because they needed it.
Well, let's do some math here. So if you were to get rid of if you were to get rid of $1 billion worth of tax breaks, right, and you were to double it, as Bezos were to say, that'd be enough to cover universal child care for every single child in this country. Okay. So are you saying that for that grant or that person that lives in Queens, the universal child care, so that they don't have to pay the cost of rent per kid in America, would not help that person out?
No, can we talk about what's realistically going to happen? I don't know how Governor Hochul doesn't see this. When you tax the rich leave. They will go to Puerto Rico. Nationwide or statewide, it doesn't make a difference. If the rich people are going to suffer for being rich,
Bezos is very clearly talking about personal taxes,
and they will bring their money elsewhere.
Taxes. Right. Alyssa, you talked about the populism that we are seeing on the right. There's all, and it's kind of where the circle meets, right, with both sides of the aisle, because you have somebody like Elizabeth Warren, and do you start to see J.D. Vance and others kind of come together on this issue? It is interesting.
Yeah, I think the bigger issue here is that you have increasing unease in society, especially amongst the lower middle classes, about the future of work and the future of their place in a society where technology is changing so fast, and AI, to the sense that what you hear from great industrialists of the time is, don't worry, you don't have to do anything. And we'll give you an income, or we'll cut your taxes, and just sit back and let us handle this. And everything's going to be fine because the technology is going to solve all your problems. And I think that sort of ignores a lot of discontent, especially amongst young people on both the left and the right, about wanting to have a purpose in work that is not connected to just getting by, and wanting to have a place in a technologically AI-driven society where they can be creative and productive and rise in their careers and in their dignity, rather than just, have billionaires tell them, don't worry, we're going to cut your taxes, and then maybe we'll give you some money and you can just paint or whatever. And that's the bigger societal issue, rather than how much 3% of this or that on any given day.
And that's a much bigger question. Bezos' argument takes that complicated issue and reduces it to one teacher in Queens. The problem is that the teacher is not the entire argument. She's an example of the larger problem. Then we get to Emily Austin's defense of billionaires as job creators. This is probably the most common argument in the billionaire debate. And there is some truth to it. Large corporations absolutely create jobs, but they can also destroy existing economic ecosystems while doing it. Think about a Walmart moving into a small town. Technically, the company may create hundreds of jobs, but those jobs don't necessarily represent new economic activity. Some of them replace jobs that already existed at locally owned stores. And that's an important distinction. A locally owned business keeps more of its money within the community. The owner may live there. Employees may spend their wages locally. Profits may circulate through other local businesses. With a massive corporation, a much larger share of the profits can flow somewhere else, to shareholders, investors, and corporate offices far outside that community. So the number of jobs might not change dramatically, but the structure of the local economy can change completely. Professor Poppy made this point particularly well. These aren't always brand new jobs appearing out of nowhere. Sometimes they're replacement jobs. The original economic ecosystem disappears, and a different one takes its place. And then there's the AI conversation. Alyssa and Josh opened what may actually be the most important issue of the entire discussion. Workers are increasingly worried about being replaced by artificial intelligence. And this isn't just a concern coming from one political side. Software developers are watching AI generate code. Paralegals are watching AI summarize legal documents. Graphic designers are watching AI create images. Writers are watching AI produce drafts in seconds. The technology is moving incredibly fast. Policy isn't. And that's the problem. We still don't have a clear answer to a very basic question. What happens when someone's job is automated faster than that person can retrain for something else? That's not some distant science fiction scenario anymore. It's already happening in parts of the economy. And neither the political left nor the political right has offered a particularly convincing answer to what workers are supposed to do when their skills become less valuable, because technology can perform the same tasks faster and cheaper. Then we come back to the tax flight argument. Emily repeatedly returned to the idea that if governments raise taxes on billionaires, those billionaires will simply leave. Maybe they'll move to Puerto Rico. Maybe they'll move to Florida. Maybe they'll move somewhere else with lower taxes. But this is where the Cornell research becomes important. Research on high-income taxpayer mobility has repeatedly found that wealthy people are generally less likely to relocate simply because of state tax increases than the political rhetoric might suggest. And there's a practical reason for that. Extreme wealth isn't created in isolation. It's connected to businesses, employees, investors, legal networks, financial institutions, infrastructure, and social relationships. A hedge fund manager based in New York can't necessarily pick up the entire operation and move it somewhere else overnight. The talent is in New York. The financial networks are there. The relationships are there. The access to capital is there. The legal and institutional infrastructure is there. So yes, wealthy people can move. And some do. But the idea that every tax increase automatically triggers mass migration of billionaires and capital is much harder to defend when you look at the actual evidence. The threat of leaving can be a powerful political argument. But the threat and the follow-through are two different things. And that's exactly why the research matters.
To get bigger and bigger and bigger. And as we look at the midterms and you look to 2028, you can't help but think somebody needs to come up with a plan.
I think you are going to see politicians in 2028 who are running, talking about tackling AI, putting some kind of guardrails on it, some kind of pauses. That polls extremely well because, to Josh's point, there are these headwinds economically that are bigger than any political party, any candidate or current politician. The fact that the purchasing power of the U.S. dollar is 3 times less than it was in 1980, but the cost of everything is even higher. Like, people are working harder than ever and having a harder time getting ahead. People are going to be begging politicians to offer real big visionary plans, and I think there's a lane for people who are willing to do that. It's going to have to be bigger than, like, we're tweaking the corporate tax rate here and we're, making it a little easier to e-file or whatever.
And I think we're seeing it already, because on both sides of the aisle, I see people are increasingly going against AI, and people are like, well, I don't want it replacing my job. And then I try to play devil's advocate, because I was speaking to somebody much older than me about this. When cars came out, and that's what they thought when this innovation happened, but then more jobs are created elsewhere, and I try to be optimistic about it, but it's getting out of hand.
And managing those traditions can mean less suffering for millions of Americans, and we're not managing them right now because the technology is outpacing the policy and the regulation. Look what happened at the White House this week. They were about to roll out an executive order to have a voluntary review of AI models. So, because it's a huge national security threat to throw these AI models out into the wild. Nobody knows what they do, much less export them. And they canceled it. It was supposed to be on Thursday, and they canceled it at the last minute because the Silicon Valley tech titans said, no, thank you. So this is where we are. We're failing to bring people along in this technological journey in a way that enables them to feel like they have a purpose in this brave new world.
It is, I was just going to say, it is a brave new world indeed.
So when you step back from the entire panel, 3 different debates start to look like parts of the same story. Billionaire taxation, the decline of small businesses, and the fear of AI replacing workers. They all come back to the same underlying question. Who is the current economic system really designed to serve? Think about it. The largest corporations can pay extremely low effective tax rates. Small businesses struggle to compete. Local jobs are replaced by lower paying corporate positions. AI threatens to eliminate certain jobs faster than workers can retrain. And when governments consider asking the wealthiest people in corporations to contribute more, the response is often the same. They'll leave. Taken together, that's a pretty revealing picture. The teacher in Queens that Bezos mentioned isn't struggling because billionaires are being taxed too much. Her situation is connected to decades of decisions about education, infrastructure, wages, worker protections, and public investment. Bezos' tax bill isn't the only factor in that equation. But it's also not irrelevant simply because one billionaire's additional taxes wouldn't solve the entire problem. That's the part of the argument worth paying attention to. So what do you think? Will AI-driven job displacement become the defining economic crisis of the next decade? And does the tax flight argument actually hold up when you look at the evidence? Or is it mainly a political pressure tactic? Let me know what you think in the comments. And subscribe to the Debate Chase. We'll keep looking past the talking points and into the studies behind them.